The following program is a co-production of Seattle Channel and Seattle City Club and sponsored by Comcast.
Wildfire season begins with a drought declared across half the state.
I have firefighters who fought for 40 years who said, and are emailing, I've never seen this in my entire life.
Is Washington prepared? And as the 50th anniversary of Stonewall nears, the fight continues for LGBTQ rights.
Oftentimes it's just been a fight for basic survival.
What we've seen in the last couple of years is a ceaseless, relentless attack on the community.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to June Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter here tonight with Washington Lands Commissioner Hilary Franz, top-notch journalists helping with the questioning this evening, C.R. Douglas from Q13 News, and Brady Pinero-Walkinshaw. He's the CEO of the environmental media nonprofit, grist.org. So my first question tonight is for you, the audience. I want, by a show of hands, for you to tell me, so when you wake up and see a warmer or drier than normal Seattle day, first, I'm guessing, work with me here, that you go, yeah, you know, great Seattle day. And then, show of hands, how many of you also feel either like guilty or weird about climate change and wildfires? Show of hands. I'm gonna do it too. Wow. Okay, well that sort of begins something that you and I spoke about, which was, I asked you, you know, you said, I used to love the sunny days. Do you still?
No.
Why?
I would say, since I took this role in 2017, I mean, we all remember those rainy, gray, overcast winters and early springs, and we just beg for the sun to come. And unfortunately, our sun and hot, dry temperatures are coming much earlier. And as a result, we are seeing more catastrophic wildfires much earlier in the season and for longer parts of our year and in every corner of our state.
It's just wild to go with wildfire, but the cheat sheet that I got from some of your staff from your office actually really was scary. It said that Washington has the highest wildfire risk in the nation.
This year.
This year. So how did this happen, and are we prepared?
So this has happened in the sense that if everybody remembers, March was a gorgeous month. And it was hot and dry in every corner of our state, and it continued that way through April and well into May. So more than half of our state isn't currently in a drought. As a result, we have very dry conditions, and with dry conditions, one simple spark, whether it's lightning or a match of some kind, will quickly spread to a large fire. And it is literally 50% of our fires today west side of the Cascades, which is a new phenomenon.
Yeah, I want to drill down into that, but the sort of how bad is it question. As you said, the governor has declared drought in, is it more than half the counties? Snowpack is low. It was kind of reasonable there, but what happened in March and April made it go down because there wasn't enough water coming back in. The forecast, as everyone's seen, warmer and drier summer. So what are you actually expecting in terms of wildfires this summer?
So we all remember 2015 was one of the worst years we've ever had, with over 1 million acres burned, and then sadly and tragically we lost a few lives. 3 of our firefighters were lost in that year. I will tell you that the conditions that we're seeing on the ground, and that firefighters I have who've been fighting fires for 30 to 40 years in the state will say, this is the worst it's ever been. And this is the kind of fire condition that leads to real catastrophic conditions, whether it's our firefighters, whether it's the landscape, or whether it's our communities. We are the worst in the nation. California's had some more moisture. We are the worst in the nation currently.
I was just going to say that. So the figure I saw for California, that they're at like 202% of snowpack. We're at 29% the last time I looked. So are we sort of in reverse this year? We're going to have a worse year than even California?
We are going to have likely a worse year than California. I would just say on scale, since over the last 5 years, it has only gotten worse every single year, the number of fires. 2017 was a little bit better, I will say. It was an improvement in the number of fires, but we are seeing a continual trend and trajectory of fires, more increased fires with more drier conditions, and we're now seeing fires that are not just, I gotta say it again, Eastern Washington, but we've had fires in our rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in every corner of this state, from the northwest to the southwest. In fact, March, it's important that you hear this. In March, in the second week alone of March, we had 54 fires in 1 week. I have firefighters who fought for 40 years who said, and are emailing, I've never seen this in my entire life. Those fires, 53 of them were in the coast, in the Wahkiakum, Grays Harbor County, in the Cowlitz County, right? If you think about it, I remember growing up.
Rainforest, right?
I grew up in the Northwest, and I remember if you went to the coast in March, you were cold, wet, and huddled inside. No, it was sunny and dry, and much of that landscape had already dried out.
So you mentioned 400 fires so far, going back to March. But what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about little brush fires by this side of the road, fires in the forest, or we know that there, if you've read the news, there's actually a sizable fire already today in Grant County.
Right.
So that's a wildfire.
Right. So the 400 fires that we've had largely to date, with the exception of Grant County, which I'll talk about, are largely fires that were brush fires. They maybe 20 acres, 50 acres. We did have one that was at 100, but again, nothing so catastrophic, but it is an indicator, right? When those fires are happening in March and April, it is an indicator of more severe and more significant catastrophic fires across the state in our traditional fire season of August and September and October. Today, we right now have the Grant County fire, where we have 18,744 acres are currently burning. We have 25% of it contained. It's a grass fire where the condition of that grass has grown so high with that early snow, and now it's dried out. I call it grassoline, right? It literally is grassoline, okay? And when a spark hits it, and then you bring those eastern winds, you will quickly, within just a few hours, have 1,000 acres burning, and very difficult to control.
So you were talking about the west side, and this is something where I'm trying to be clear so that I understand really what we're talking about. What's unusual is to have drought on this side of the Cascades, very unusual. So are we talking about things like Paradise, California, where you have, overtaking a community on the west side? Are we really discussing that?
I mean, we are at an agency level definitely looking at the context of where our communities are planned, where are they developed, where are we seeing drier, hotter conditions, where are evacuation routes. I will say that, California in that situation is one of a hotter, drier climate and some really significant Baja winds, right? But really poor planning as to evacuation. I think, but the context for everybody to know is this is not an east side issue. This is not just a west side issue. It's a Washington state issue, and everybody can be doing something to prepare and make their community and their own homes more resilient in the face of fire, and be a partner with my agency in protecting themselves and their communities.
So for the last 2 years, August is kind of a different month than we all know, those of us who have lived here for a while, that, we have this smoke. You can't go outside. Smoke season. There's artwork at Seattle Center starting on June 14 about smoke, the new normal. Is that what it is? Is it going to be the new normal? Is August a completely different kind of month than we're accustomed to?
I will tell you that my job for Washington State is to make sure it's not the new normal. That's my job. Now, I will say it's going to take us a little while to get out of this problem, right? Because it's taken 25 to 50 years to get into this problem. And I'll talk a little about why. And that's really the forest health crisis that we have, right? It's also an investment in wildfire protection. I do want to highlight that we're already seeing haze. If everybody's looked at your beautiful sunsets over the last few days, that's because Alberta right now has 1 million acres that have already burned. Okay, so this isn't something
that's quite early for Alberta to start as well.
Very, very early. And last year, part of the reason we saw so much smoke on the west side of the state is we did have, at any given time in BC, about 600 fires on the landscape, right? So this is something that can't be solved just at a state level. We certainly need to do everything possible to make our landscapes and our communities more resilient to fire and have the resources. But we have to also work across boundaries. In fact, not just state boundaries and national boundaries, but international.
So the old Department of Natural Resources, DNR, sort of had a philosophy. It was do not respond. How is your approach going to be different?
So I'll just say this, it wasn't the philosophy, do not respond. I will tell you that I think we had that reputation, right? And that's important to highlight. We recognized 2014 to 2016 when we had the most catastrophic fires, not only in number really, but in the amount of acres burned, with over 1.5 million acres burned, that we had to attack this in two ways. One, we had to attack it in the way we fight fires. We had to be much more smart about it, and we had to prove that we can actually protect and put fires out quickly and fast. Otherwise, we weren't going to get any new resources from the legislature or the federal government to do that. The second thing we had to do was tackle the underlying reason we're seeing more significant fires. We are seeing hotter, drier conditions for sure, but the underlying too that is coupled with that is we have a forest health crisis in Washington state.
Brady Walkinshaw from GRIST joined the conversation.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Joni. You know, as you've laid out, the intensity and the frequency and the geographic distribution of these fires is only going to intensify into the future. Do you think we ought to be curbing development in areas that are exposed to higher fire risk? You know, everything from those gorgeous cabins in the Metau through to the expansion of towns into areas where it might put firefighters at risk. And should we be taking steps to kind of curb development?
I think we need to come at this from a couple angles. One, we do need to look at it a land use planning and says, here are the high risk areas that we already know exist based on the forest health crisis, but also what we're seeing over a trend across Washington state. And then how do we work with the local governments so that they understand how to make communities more fire resilient? Not only the ones that are there now, but also the ones that are coming, right? Also think about evacuation rates. So land use planning has to be in it. A second piece that is really critical is the forest health crisis. So we have 2.7 million acres of forests in eastern Washington alone that are already dying or already dead. About half of that is federal lands. The other half is state, tribal, and private lands. We have not done the work we need to get in there and make those forests more resilient. And literally, forests are used to fires. This is not a new thing. Go back 100 years, right? Even in this area, we had 1 million acres burned, you know, in the central Puget Sound way back in time, right? The reality is that forests were more resilient to that fire and could technically almost put itself out, and it was a regeneration. But because we have dead, dying, diseased trees, right, and we haven't managed those lands in a way that created more resilient fires, they lead to more catastrophic. And so I'll just say what I mean by that, really, so people know.
Yeah, please do.
So first, what we've done is we brought forest health science and we said, let's look at it watershed by watershed in all of eastern Washington. Let's identify those high-risk forests based on our communities, watersheds based on the condition of the forest, but also proximity to population centers, right? And then let's specifically lay out what the treatments are and be agnostic to property lines, because wildfire and disease are agnostic to property lines. And so then we'll specifically go in there and we'll say, we need certain spatial gaps between the trees. We'll get in and remove the dead, dying, diseased trees. We'll remove that smaller diameter trees that are competing with the larger trees for water. We'll get in there and also bring prescribed fire back into the landscape. I've seen with my own eyes a fire that came down in 2015 through a canyon and just blew through an area that had not been managed and maintained. It was very dense, but also very weak, right? And that fire literally laid itself down at the line of a treated forest by itself. That's what a forest resilience is, right? So we can make those kinds of, and we are. We're already last year treated 35,000 acres. We're treating 50,000 acres this year, 70,000 next year, and we'll keep on going.
So does that mean less development into high-risk areas?
So that's a local government planning piece. Okay. But I think our first step is to say, here's the risk of your community. Here's where those risks are. Here's what you can do to make sure that you're being smarter about where development's happening. So you're not only protecting those homeowners, but you're also protecting our firefighters. Because every one of our firefighters are putting their lives on the line to protect that landscape, but also the people who live there in the communities.
I want to talk more about the diseased trees. Are they a result of climate change?
I will tell you it's both, right? So absolutely hotter, it's both the context of climate change, hotter, drier conditions, less water, less moisture, but it's also the fact that we haven't managed these forests, right? And so what's happened is they've gotten in there and they've grown and lots of density, right? And you know, it's almost like if you have a forest that is competing, right, and you've got lots and lots of trees competing for water and nutrients in the soil, and the water and nutrients are going down less, right, and also that forest has not allowed fire to come in naturally, right, so that it doesn't have the natural regeneration that forests had before humans were in it, you have a weak forest. So it's a combination of both of those.
Hi, audience question.
Hi, my name is Bea Covington. I'm the director of the King Conservation District, and I wanted to pivot the conversation back a little bit to what you were talking about previously. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, when you think about preparedness and prevention planning, the role that conservation districts can play in partnering both with the state agencies and local governments to help communities and private property owners take proactive steps to do some of this planning.
That's right. So conservation districts are hugely valuable. Just like we don't fight fires by ourselves, we have local and federal agencies working with us as one team. The same is true for our conservation districts. We leverage our conservation districts in the context of forest health and forest resiliency in being able to actually go on small forest landowners, or 40% of our forest lands in Washington State, help bring those resources to them, know what to do to help make their forest lands more resilient in the face of fire. Also, what homeowners can do to create fire-adapted communities. Every homeowner can make their home more resilient to fire, just many of them don't know what to do. And conservation districts are a huge partner with us. Thank you.
C.R. Douglas.
Let me pivot to a different topic, because you oversee more than just forest lands. You run a solar farm, it turns out. Earlier this year, you leased to a utility that's going to put panels up, 400 acres in eastern Washington. The ranchers who have been using the land and been leasing from the state argue that you terminated their contract early, didn't give them compensation, that kind of thing. Now you're getting more leasing it to a solar farm than to ranchers, but over time you want to do more solar farms and more wind farms, so this will come up presumably. What's your policy on breaking leases, and especially ranchers that have put some money into these properties, they built fences, they have a livelihood, all the rest?
Yeah, so just for the audience, everybody knows, because most people don't know this, I oversee 6 million acres of land in Washington State, besides the wildfire fighting team. 2.6 million acres aquatic, 2 million acres of forest land, 1 million acres of ag, and then I actually have about 40,000 acres of commercial real estate, including the Edgewater, all the way to Safeways, Costco's, Fred Meyer's, business parks. So within that, we have in our 1 million acres of agricultural land, pretty significant part, about 25% of that portfolio is in high-value vineyards, orchards. We're actually the largest wheat grower, and we're becoming the largest vineyard grower in Washington State. Then we have 75% that has been in more low value, largely sort of grazing or dry crop. Our responsibility when we manage our uplands, that 3 million acres, is we generate over $220 million a year for your schools and your counties, your basic health and human services, housing, police and fire. And we represent in some counties 40% of their operating budget. That's how significant it is. So our fiduciary responsibility to those beneficiaries to generate as much money as we can in a sustainable way, intergenerationally. So we've had historically grazing leases. There hasn't been this interest or desire in wind and solar and other high value uses like vineyards and orchards even. But now with a growing ag economy and a growing clean energy economy, interest is now very much developing. We have 21 wind leases, but no solar when I came into this position. We are rapidly scaling up. When we go to wind and solar, we move from about $1.43 an acre to $1,100 to $1,400 an acre. It's a 98,000% increase on your investment for your schools, right? And so for us, we look at that, we have that fiduciary responsibility that is in Constitution. That's what we do in meeting that. And what we've been doing is actually working in this case with ranchers and saying, look, we recognize this means you've been there for 4 generations. We know this has been your long-term revenue source for your family and your community. We have to move to a new model on this land because it's highly valuable for solar or for wind or other use. And then we are working with them to identify other lands that we may not have been utilizing for anything. And including also, we do have the ability to move them into forest health management because they're
But some of them say they have leases and that you've given them, 60 days notice, something like that. I mean, why not 2, 3, 4 years notice? There was a proposal in the legislature to actually try and mandate that.
Yeah, so we're actually required to give them 80 days notice. And oftentimes we actually are working and give them, in the case of solar, we actually gave them a year notice. And we went actually met with them on the land and said, these 36 properties, we have 36 identified for solar. These 36 properties are right now been slated as an interest by multiple bidders. They're not utilities, they're actually solar development companies that then do RFPs with the utilities. And we believe we're going to be moving over the next 1 to 2 years to do solar development on it, and it's because it's our fiduciary responsibility. And then we work with them, and part of that is all the outreach in the front. It's the outreach up front to do it. I know historically there was a piece of property that we will now be generating that's in high value agriculture. Will generate about $40 million over the next 20 years, or I'm sorry, 30 to 40 years, which is a huge deal because we were getting very little. That was a context where we didn't do enough outreach. That happened in 2015. We actually paid them back. We paid them full yield of what they would have been able to grow for 2 years.
I want to go back to wildfires here. What can people in this room do to help? Are we talking fewer showers, less lawn watering, fewer campfires? Fewer campfires. You've said a sizable number, maybe most of the wildfires are human caused.
That's right. So a lot of times when we hear all this news about drought and hotter, drier conditions, and we can't control the weather per se right now, we get very much in a sense of hopelessness. What can we do? We actually can do something. Besides the forest health work that our agency is doing, about 90% of our fires are caused by humans. 90% are caused by humans. It could be a campfire. It could be a brush fire that we thought.
So should people not do campfires this summer? Is that
so? First, you should check burn
definite?
bans. You should check burn bans, and many of them are going in place already. And I would suggest you try not to do campfires unless you have it in a very controlled environment in your backyard there, right? If I could be, and I think we have to be very, very much preventing the kinds of starting of fires. Like, for example, parking on dry grass will actually cause a fire.
Yeah.
So it's all about education and saying, if you have a chain dragging on the bottom of your car, that will create a spark that quickly launches over to the side of the road and spreads rapidly and creates a 1,000-acre fire in no time.
So when we met, you were talking about your arsenal, helicopters and planes and a variety of things, and you do have the ability, you have more helicopters and planes coming, but for some crazy reason, they're not going to be available for this summer.
I think the biggest statement that I'll say is that historically across the state, we're the largest wildfire fighting, and we are all lands, all hands, but because our agency is now having so many natural disasters, floods, fires, landslides, we're now becoming an all lands, all hands, all risk agency. We have not at this state invested in natural disaster. We have not. And we haven't invested also in the underlying problem, whether it's in the context of land use and preparedness, or it's in the context of forest health resiliency. So we have been working tirelessly. I have 7 helicopters for the state. They all fought in the Vietnam War. How many of you are still driving the car from the Vietnam War era? Right? Okay, give them a hand, because I have not found anybody in the entire state. So it's great to know we have 2 people still doing that. I will tell you, my pilots go up in 100+ degree temperatures and really challenging environment. But it's a sign that we have not invested. And those 7 helicopters used to fight fires just in Eastern Washington, but now we're in every corner. So this legislative session, we pushed to have significant funding and ideally dedicated funding to actually implement our wildfire strategic plan and our forest health plan. We were successful in securing $50 million, the most we ever have. About half of that is for fire protection, the other half for forest health treatments. We will now be securing 2 more Vietnam era helicopters, beautifully put together by mechanics. We will also, we have increased the number of exclusive contracts with the fixed wing, and we pre-position those assets now in those areas where we know we're going to have fire, which means we're not, and this is why we're faster. We put more than 90% of our fires we keep to below 10 acres because we're able to get quicker to the line because we pre-position.
Do you still have them based in Olympia? Or
no. So what I did is when I, recognizing we only had the resources we had and it wasn't going to increase in any time, but we were seeing more catastrophe fires, we did 3 strategic things. First, we leveraged our air assets. The moment there's smoke in the air, we put them up and we get them on the fires quickly so our hand crews can get in, contain the fire, and do it safely and quickly. The second thing was we pre-positioned not only our helicopters and our fixed wing, but also our strike teams, our engines, and we got them so they're not spending 3 to 4 hours to get to the fire line. Because as I just talked about, Grant County, 3 to 4 hours is the difference of 100 acres to thousands of acres. And then the last thing we did is It is absolutely critical we leverage every single resource we have in our firefighting team. Local firefighters, state firefighters, and federal. And so we began training together. So we were communicating and collaborating, coordinating way before fire season started. As I always say, I never see the Seahawks going to the Super Bowl and meeting for the first time at the Super Bowl. You must train as a team beforehand. And that's made us so that we can get on those fires and keep the damage down. 430,000 acres last year, still significant, but we had more fires and more geography to cover, and far less than 2015, where 1 million acres burned, and they were all on the east side of the state largely.
So there's some talk about your political future. Are you planning to run for governor in 2020?
Right now, I'm clearly very much focused on wildfire.
You have a few things to do, I know, but
it's sort of a 24/7. So I will say, it's an honor. A lot of people have been asking me, not knowing yet what Governor Inslee's going to do, as he's now clearly running for president.
Would you run against Jay Inslee?
I'm going to finish the first question.
Good.
And the first question, the first question is, so a lot of people have been asking me to consider. And a lot of people have been asking, because one of the things that I bring is not only the executive experience of running of 6 agencies, frankly, and agencies that are in every corner of the state in some of the most challenging environments, but also I have very much been working to bridge the divide that exists in Washington state between rural and urban, which is significant. Much of my work in generating over $220 million a year is in the most rural communities that have the most limited amount of resources. And we're talking they're facing job loss and unemployment, 9 to 12%, that's been there for 3 generations. And there hasn't been people really leaning in and trying to solve that. Also have been working very closely to bridge the divide between the Republican and Democrat, because we cannot be effective together unless we're working together. And so a lot of people are asking, I'm very much considering right now running in 2020. I'm waiting to see what Governor Inslee does.
Because you would or wouldn't run against Jay Inslee?
Right now I'm not considering running against Governor Inslee.
I see.
Oh no, and just to, in the spirit of continuing those hard questions, do you support Governor Inslee for president?
I right now am thrilled about what Governor Inslee is doing in raising the whole profile on climate change. I'm going to tell you, my agency, not a day goes by we're not on the front lines of climate change. So I'll give you an example. You've heard about fire. I don't need to talk about that. And we've had thousands of acres of our forest die literally in the period of 4 to 6 months. But in addition to that, we're now responding to floods. Okanagan County last year in April 2018 had the worst flood it's had since 1973. The snowpack in Canada melted so fast it raced down and flooded every one of those towns down that entire river. And they made a call for help. State of emergency was declared, but no one showed up. I got a call and I said, I have 300 firefighters. They will come tomorrow because we're not yet fighting those blazes. And I will tell you, we were lucky there was only 1 flood incident, because we were then fighting fires all the way from May all the way to October. And it's clear that this state is not prepared for the kinds of disasters we are already seeing. I already have crops that are drying out. I'm already seeing dust storms, not only on our lands, but also on many of our communities' lands. That's our agricultural economy, but it's also the food that feeds us. And water shortage is a huge deal right now, and it's only gonna get worse. So I am thrilled that that issue is being raised at a national level, because we need every state and every leader, local, state, and federal, to recognize the problem and start to build a plan to respond. And that's what our agency is doing, is we're right now building the first climate resiliency plan for Washington state.
And so time's running away. We kind of have a surprise for all of you folks. This is Smokey Bear.
Hey!
It's hokey, I get it. This is Smokey Bear's 75th birthday. 75 years of firefighting. All righty, hugs, okay. Joe Biden, got it.
Smokey's my friend, you guys. Smokey Bear, it's his 75th birthday.
You're looking pretty good. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. I'm gonna go do this. We have been discussing the coming fire season with State Lands Commissioner Hilary Franz, back shortly to talk about LGBTQ pride and rights in a couple of Washingtons. Thank you. We're back, ready to get smart about continuing challenges for LGBTQ folks and to raise a few civic cocktails to this proud community. Our guests are Tobi Hill-Meyer, co-executive director of the Gender Justice League, also Ann Levinson, former Seattle deputy mayor and judge, and a leader in the LGBTQ movement. and a much longer resume that I'm not going into. We'll start with you, Tobi. Can you tell us about LGBTQIA? How and when did the term go from LGBT and expand?
Yeah, well, actually, each one of those letters in the acronym is pretty significant and has taken about a decade to add. So way back when, it was just the gay liberation movement, but people said, hey, you have to include lesbians too, so people would say gay and lesbian in the 70s. In the 80s, people fought to add bisexual. In the 90s, you started seeing some groups use transsexual or transgender. And now we have Q for queer. That's important to a lot of people because it can be distinct. It can be meaningfully distinct from gay or lesbian or bi. And for those of you who you don't quite understand what that means, I like to just give, it's the none of the above answer. So like if someone is having trouble and they feel like they don't actually fit into the options in front of them, none of the above can kind of be represented as queer. There's a lot of people, especially of younger generations, that are primarily identifying as queer and not gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And then the I and the A is for intersex and asexual. And so intersex is about people whose bodies are different from what you would expect male or female to be. And it's a very different set of issues than what you typically hear from in the LGBTQ community spaces. And so it's actually really important that you only include the I if you're actually including intersex people. Like, if your work is including intersex people, that's great and wonderful, and let everyone know that. If your work isn't, don't put the I in, because then you're just going to throw off all the Google searches, and people will be looking for intersex resources and just come up with what you're saying.
I see. Ann Levinson, take us back to Stonewall. LGBTQ folks were arrested for being LGBTQ.
Right.
Did you ever imagine that half a century later that gays and lesbians would be treated well in many states and that same-sex marriage would be the law of the land in all 50 states?
Yeah, great question. No, I mean, we've made tremendous strides toward individual liberty and rights in those 50 years. We should keep in mind, though, the fight in our country started many decades before that. I mean, as early as the 1920s, there was a gentleman just trying to organize folks, produce a newsletter, and at that time he did get arrested just for distributing a newsletter. His house was raided by the police. He lost his job. His papers were seized. And in those decades, it was illegal simply to associate with other LGBTQ folks. You couldn't be employed by government. So the landscape has changed tremendously. What Stonewall was, for those who don't know, is in
A lot of folks don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So in 1967, Stonewall was a bar in New York, and their bars were one of the few places where the gay community could gather. But even then, bars often had black protection on the windows so that people couldn't see in. There was no name out front. You had to be careful going in and coming out. And police raided them with impunity unless they were paid off. And so over the decades, the community got so often they were arrested. For example, the law in New York at the time was, as a woman, you had to wear 3 articles of clothing that were considered consistent with your gender, or you could be arrested. You know, officers would arrest you for things like a so-called obstruction. And so they would come into bars with impunity, and then they would arrest people, they would lose their jobs, they would parade them in that sort of way. And so what happened with Stonewall was, after years and years and years of this happening in bars across the country, folks got so frustrated. There had been a similar uprising, if you will, in California just the year before, but there hadn't been media coverage of it, so it didn't have the same impact.
Well, if you ask a lot of people now, and maybe this is just sort of mainstream people, not within the community, they'd say, you know, gay and lesbian rights, that's settled now. You've won, right?
Yeah. We should be so lucky. So a lot of people think that because there was a marriage equality ruling by our Supreme Court, which allowed for same-sex marriage in our country, and 27 countries do now allow same-sex marriage. It is legal. But you don't have to look far to see how many barriers there still are to equal rights and liberties. So, for example, in many states, you can still get fired or denied housing or services simply for being LGBTQ. In many states, what's so-called conversion therapy, which is a long, ill-reputed practice used often by parents to try to force their children to change their sexual orientation. That is still allowed in the majority of states. In most states across the country, because there are not anti-discrimination laws, many other services that you would normally think everyone has a right to can be denied to you. In our juvenile justice and our child welfare system, there are disproportionate numbers of LGBTQ people, particularly trans kids, and our systems are not designed to support them. So if you, for example, are an LGBTQ kid who needs a foster family, in many states, the state does not have to provide an affirming home for you. And I could go on and on. But on top of that, what we've seen in the last couple of years is a ceaseless, relentless attack on the community, as with many marginalized communities, by the Trump-Pence administration.
And we'll get into that. Tobi, it sounds like the trans community in particular is now under attack in this Trump era. Why now?
Well, I would say as we got a marriage equality ruling from the Supreme Court, suddenly a lot of our organizations had to kind of pivot to what is the next issue. And so it made sense for a lot of LGBTQ organizations to say, like, we've been talking about trans rights for a while, let's finally do something about it. Well, the other side was in the same situation. You can't fundraise on fighting marriage equality when it's more or less a settled issue and you're not fighting on it. So they needed something else to be able to fundraise, to fight on, and pretty quickly targeted trans people. And you'd see that again and again, that there was this very rapid pivot where they would not have focused on trans people the same kind of way even just 5 years ago.
Because of the successes for gays and lesbians and same-sex marriage, that almost like prompted.
Yeah, the talking points that they were working on and that they were fundraising on weren't resonating as much. So they needed to find a new target, and that was trans people.
Key participants in Stonewall, some of them, were transgender women of color. And you flash forward to now, and transgender women of color are some of the most likely folks to be targeted. Talk about the violence and
yeah. So definitely, one of the things that we do in the trans community is we have the Day of Remembrance every year where we reflect upon all of those who have been murdered for being trans. And so there are groups that keep and track that as best as we can, and we see every year that the vast majority of people on that list are trans women of color, especially immigrants and sex workers. And so, you know, one of the things is we've been in this fight and fighting since the beginning, since Stonewall, since before Stonewall, but oftentimes it's just been a fight for basic survival. And so you'll see that with all of the changes in policies that we've had, that makes a very big difference for some people, especially people who aren't dealing with the multiple intersections of different kinds of oppression. But if you are a young trans woman of color who's been kicked out of your house, you're a minor, you're having to do survival sex work as your only option to survive, things actually don't look that different than they did back in 1969.
Can we talk specifically about Trump administration policy on transgender people in the military? Those changes and how you view those?
Yeah, so definitely the military is one of the, or is the largest single employer of trans people in the country. So this is something that affects a lot of trans people. And when the government is able to have a policy of discrimination, like we've been talking about, should you ban discrimination or should you allow discrimination? But this is a policy requiring discrimination. And when the government is requiring discrimination, that gets used as a justification time and time again to have discrimination elsewhere. We actually saw right after Trump was elected, there were some right-wing anti-LGBTQ organizations that a document got leaked of their strategic plan. And it was like a 4-point strategic plan for how they were going to remove trans people from the public. And step one was to ban trans people from the military, and then leverage that to be able to incorporate more discrimination elsewhere through religious freedom acts.
Sierra Douglas, join us.
And Levinson, let me ask you about the post-Stonewall victories here locally.
Sure.
I mean, it seemed like every decade there was something that was passed, and there was always a backlash to it.
Right.
I mean, if you look back in the 70s and the 80s, you had I-13, you had I-35. They were trying to roll back city ordinances that were granting rights. You had more recently R-71, R-75 that were trying to roll back domestic partnership and marriage. I mean, every victory had a backlash. Those were fights you probably didn't want. And yet, every time a backlash got on the ballot, and all of them lost when they went to a public vote, did the public vote actually help the cause? They, in fact, cemented the original victory.
Right, very good question. So we've had here in 77, one of the wonderful things about Seattle is it's been a welcoming community for decades. And in the mid-70s, the Seattle City Council passed non-discrimination in housing and jobs that included sexual orientation. And there were a couple of police officers who are part of the Anita Bryant movement, the national movement, so-called Save Our Children movement, who sponsored an initiative to try to repeal that in 77. And that was the first sort of organizing in our community, involved the business community and involved faith leaders, the LGBT community and others. And Seattle voters beat that back by 2-1. And then in 1990, they tried again with Initiative 35, which was to repeal just the right to take funeral leave or sick leave for a city employee when you had a domestic partner who was ill or who had died. And again, we had to fight that back. And then there was a group out of Oregon in the 90s called the Oregon Citizens Alliance that came and tried to do statewide initiatives to prohibit the teaching of so-called good homosexuality in schools, to prohibit gays and lesbians from adopting children, from marrying, from being teachers, a wide range of things. And we had to form an organization called Hands Off Washington, a statewide organization, to stop that from happening. You all may remember seeing those bumper stickers all over the state. And then there was an effort in 2006. It had taken us 29 years to get state law changed to include sexual orientation and gender identity. We had a very good state anti-discrimination law that had for years included gender non-discrimination and non-discrimination on the basis of religion and other categories, but had not included sexual orientation or gender identity. It took us 29 years to get those few words added. And before the governor even had a chance to sign it, again, there was an effort to repeal it, and that was referendum 65. It was led by right-wing religious organizations along with Tim Eyman, and they tried to keep that. We were able to keep that off the ballot. And then a couple of years later, they tried to repeal domestic partnerships. And a couple of years after that, they tried to repeal marriage. So to your question, in each of those, it was quite painful. One's rights should not be voted on. But each of those helped us cement relationships with allies and build coalitions. And when your rights are threatened, people will stand up and stand beside you, and that's what happened in our state. So we from the late 70s through each of those, I chaired several of those, and with intentionality, we organized in coalitions. So we had faith-based leaders, we had business community leaders, we had nonprofit leaders, we had labor. Across the state, to have people standing together is a reinforcement of what we stand for as communities and as a state. And it also helps to educate. That provides an opportunity to go to every editorial board in the state and educate. And what we learned, not only the need to be resilient, but that we couldn't just fight these fights on election day. We had to constantly be working on changing hearts and minds. So when that threat did come, we had shared commitment from so many folks. And the most important thing was we had to come out. When the community was invisible, it made it so much easier to demonize each of us. And so when people came out to their families and they came out in their synagogues and churches and they came out in their workplaces, all of a sudden you had so many more allies who said, well, no, I know her and she's not like that.
That did seem to be like a total tipping point in the whole.
Yeah, so that was a huge, and that was a great risk for many people. As I've mentioned, in so many places, it is still legal to discriminate on that. So to come out was not an easy thing for a lot of folks to do.
Brady Walkinshaw. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to add, knowing someone who's LGBTQ is one of the biggest indicators of whether or not someone is going to be supportive of our rights. And that is really critical. What we've seen actually is that while that number has really increased for how many people know someone who's gay, lesbian, or bisexual, in Washington state, only 25% of people know someone who is transgender. Right. And that still is much higher than the national number, which is 14%. Oh, wow. And just in comparison, 16% of people say that they have seen a ghost. So.
Nicely done. Nicely done.
That's great, Tobi. I guess my next, my question is to you and perhaps also to Anne. There's this great, I think this phenomenal local journalist that some of you may know named Michael Hobbs, and he writes for Huffington Post, and he does these really long form pieces. And a couple years ago, he published this piece that really made the rounds amongst communities I know called The Epidemic of Gay Loneliness. And it was a long form piece talking about how with the kind of winning of so many rights at the same time, we've simultaneously seen an extraordinary increase in depression, mental illness, suicide, young people, but also people across all ages who identify as LGBTQ, experiencing and struggling with mental illness and depression and anxiety and a lot of things around that. And I just wondered, that article I thought was very impactful, and wondered if you might comment a little bit on that and how you're seeing that in your work today, and whether you feel like we're making progress or we're backsliding, and what you feel might be driving that.
Definitely. I think we need to be able to fight on a policy level and try to shift for our rights. That's one of the major things Gender Justice League does. But at the same time, that's not necessarily a one-to-one impact on people's lives. So just because same-sex marriage is legal doesn't mean that you have someone to marry. And just because you now have like non-discrimination protections for employment doesn't mean you can get a good job. And so we still have all these different ways that our communities are marginalized, that trans people in particular are less likely to be able to finish school because oftentimes of facing a lot of harassment. When you don't finish school, it can just become a snowball effect of having a harder time getting access to good employment, or just any of the different things that make someone's that give someone what they need to be able to live their life. And so that's why it's really critical that we are working on that level as well. It's one of the things that Gender Justice League did when a year and a half ago we found out that we were getting a new office that was also coded residential, had a loft, a little kitchenette, and a laundry facility down the hall. we opened up our office for emergency housing for members of the community. And we're an advocacy organization, not a direct services organization, but we did this because we feel we have to do this because there are so many people in our community who are suffering. And we can work on these policy issues, but that's not necessarily going to mean that someone is able to pay their rent next month. And so we need to always be working on both sides of that.
And if I can add to that, sort of at the other end of the spectrum, for seniors, they still face issues of where they're going to live as they age. And so there are a lot of senior residential communities that don't still allow LGBT folks, even if you are a married couple, if they don't approve of same-sex marriage.
So Ann, that begs something that you and I talked about when we met before this. A lot of the concern now is about what judges will do. And so you sent me a few examples, and one was this situation. It was in Missouri, so it wasn't in Washington, where, I'll just read the lead of this story. A federal judge this week ruled against a lesbian couple who sued a Missouri retirement home for rejecting their apartment application because their marriage is not, quote, understood in the Bible, end quote. And this is a couple that had been in a committed relationship for 40 years, married for a decade. Yeah. So I'm wondering, can you imagine what would happen if that story was happening here in Washington State?
Right. Well, part of the zealous rollback of rights that the Trump-Pence administration is undertaking is they know they don't have to get the court to overturn what's called the Obergefell decision, the marriage equality decision, but they can, in essence, undercut all the rights allowed by that decision. So LGBT folks can still get married, but they can make sure everything from, for example, whether you can be denied health care coverage, whether you can be denied housing, whether the clerk can even deny your certificate of marriage, whether you can be denied the right to adopt children, whether you can be denied, for example, there was a same-sex couple in the news recently who, two men, one of whom is a U.S. citizen, the other was British-born but also U.S. citizen, came back to the country. They'd had a child through the British gentleman's sperm and an egg donor, and the State Department is telling them that child will not be a U.S. citizen because in their view, their marriage is not the type of marriage that the law has in mind. So in every way that you might think, the rights that you accrue to you because of being married, the administration is trying to, every day, take away each of those. And so in addition to appointing very anti-LGBT federal judges throughout the circuits and at the U.S. Supreme Court to rule in these cases, they are administratively doing this agency by agency.
And one of those areas, Tobi, is in healthcare.
Yes.
There's a sense that healthcare workers could refuse to do gender reassignment surgery or just refuse other services to trans people.
Yeah, so just for that first one, it takes years and years of study to be able to provide gender-affirming surgery. So that's not something that we're going to likely see. But the biggest problem is just refusal to provide care at all. Where people aren't necessarily saying, I don't want to write you that prescription, but they're saying, I don't want this person in my office. Or you know, you'll hear all the time of like someone who goes to a physical, and I had one friend who went to a physical, and the doctor would like listen to their heart and you know, had their breathing and put their hand on their shoulder, and this person left. It was the first time their doctor had ever touched them, because they had previously had another doctor who would just kind of hold the stethoscope out like this and make sure to like minimize any kind of touch. And so like she didn't actually know what a physical was because she was being provided such substandard care. And so like that's the kind of thing that we tend to really worry about when you find those kinds of denials where people are just going to provide poor care or not provide care at all.
And Joni, if I could add to that, the rules that the HHS, the federal agency, has adopted allow the refusal of care to a wide variety of people, just as they're doing on contraception coverage and other things, but also allow the refusal of even a referral for care. And they're providing federal protections for those who wish to exercise their right to refuse care instead of providing protections for those who need the care.
Audience question.
Hi, my name is Barbara. I'm from Beacon Hill originally. How much of this is a generational thing? I'm a boomer with a millennial child and who looks at me like, how can your generation have done this? Why is it still like this? And I realize that we can't change all of this right away, but is there a generational hope here, I guess, is my question?
Generational.
I feel like we can see the change happening over time, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's just generational. There are definitely millennials who are anti-LGBTQ, and there are plenty of boomers who are pro-LGBTQ. And so what tends to be the issue is that we just need to keep pushing on this and understand that different generations have different expectations. Like that what millennials have grown up seeing as normal is very, very different. And so you're coming from a different starting point, but that doesn't mean the ending point is any different.
So C.R. Douglas, tight question.
Yeah, tight question for Ann Levinson. If you go back to Stonewall and you were looking forward,
Right.
You probably wouldn't have predicted that the first big victories were traditional institutions.
Yeah.
I mean, marriage becomes the law of the land nationally, and the military integrates before you even have a federal non-discrimination in the workplace. Why did the traditional institutions win first?
There's a lot of irony in that. So folks like me, when we were in our radical years,
You're not in your radical years anymore?
Marriage was a patriarchal institution. I didn't want anything to do with it. And military, oh my gosh, we were, objecting, we were anti-war folks. So the fact that our movement shifted to prioritize those was with intentionality, in that those are, for sort of mainstream America, those are traditional institutions. And so as a community, we were saying—
But so is the workplace.
Yeah, but more so, we want to volunteer to serve our country in war, right? We want to enter into a lifelong commitment with the person we love in a very traditional, often church-sanctioned way. And so it becomes a different debate, not quite as foreign to folks as some of these other debates. Likewise, with regard to workplace discrimination, it's not as visible in the same way to folks, and it's not as emotional. And those two battles were very emotive. And you'll see from the marriage debate of a couple of years ago, we were no longer talking about rights. We were talking about the golden rule, and wouldn't you like all of your children treated the same way, to have the opportunity to walk down the aisle? And that resonated so much more with people who saw the personal harm that was being done.
And so we'll leave it right there. I want to say many thanks to Tobi Hill-Meyer and Ann Levinson for a really great discussion during Pride Month. Civic Cocktail will take a break and return in the fall. Have a warm, not too warm, summer, and thanks for watching.